We live in an era in which popular politics and the mass media seem to have an unprecedented importance in the conduct of political life. From newspapers and television to Twitter and Facebook, modern politics seems to have been deeply influenced by the evolution of communication technologies. Technologies which have revolutionized the way in which political elites communicate with the masses. However, elite efforts to rally popular support to their causes is nothing new. In this episode of Talking History, we go back to antiquity to discuss the role of mass media and mass communications in ancient Rome. I'm Jean Badgelan.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you're listening to Talking History.
Joining us today is Dr. Bryan Brinkman. Dr. Brinkman is an assistant professor in the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Religions here at Missouri State University. He is a specialist on the history of the ancient world whose research focuses on issues of mass communication in antiquity. Dr. Brinkman, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to begin by asking you a question about what mass communications and what mass media looks like in the Roman Empire, or in the Roman Republic, indeed, in antiquity more generally. I mean, when we think of mass communications, we think of technologies that came into being, with the printing press and later on with radio, television, and now, of course, with the internet. But your research looks at mass communications in a time before these technologies came into existence. So can you outline what you're talking about when you're talking about mass communications?
Sure. And usually when I use the term mass communications, if it's in print or something, I usually have scare quotes around it because for exactly that reason, that people don't tend to think of it in the same way. But it certainly did exist in antiquity. We just have to think of the mass as sort of a different level than what we're generally used to when we think of something like the internet, or even television or radio, something like that. So when I'm talking about mass communication, it basically breaks down into two different areas. One is textual. But even that's a little bit problematic. I'll come back to that in a second. And the second is oral. So oral communication, just speaking and listening. And one of the things about communication in general in antiquity, and something that seems kind of distant from us, but really I don't think we should think of it that way, is how often we use just speaking to one another face to face. Right? Think about when you go throughout the day, how many words would you say come out of just normal communication of you speaking to another person? Very likely as more oftentimes than might come out in what you're reading or writing, right? So that orality is central. It's always been part of human communication, right? Since we've had language, and it was a huge part in antiquity, and I would suggest still part of us today. We just kind of forget about how central it is to our lives. So going back to the first part about text, so certainly a number of different types of texts were circulated in antiquity, right? We have famous poems and history and political treatises and all of this sort of stuff. But the vast majority of people in antiquity, and let's just take the Roman Empire, which probably was the height of this, most people were not by any means literate from a modern conception. Numbers on all of this are very difficult to get a handle on, but we can say maybe 10% of the population would have been literate in terms of how we would probably think of that designation. So most people weren't reading Virgil, right, or Homer or anything like that, right? Both of which were actually usually recited generally, but people weren't reading those types of texts. So when I talk about mass communication, the types of texts I'm usually referring to are things like inscriptions, right? So I'm an expert in epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions. We don't get around the issue of literacy when we're dealing with inscriptions because people still have to read them. But even think about inscriptions today, right? And this is another thing where we encounter them all the time, but we don't think about them as much and don't realize how central they were in antiquity, especially like ancient Rome. The inscriptions generally tend to be very short and formulaic. And so let's take something like a funerary inscription. We still use the same thing, right? Very common for us to put up something like a tombstone. This is by far, for the ancient world, the number one type of text we have are inscriptions that were written as grave markers for people. And with the issue of literacy, they're very formulaic, right? So you wouldn't have to be literate by a modern definition to still get the gist of what it's saying, right? So we have to kind of temper what we think of when we think of what do we mean by literate, right? So in terms of written communication, I'm talking about basically inscriptions. The other kind of inscriptions that we look at, and especially if we think about something like politics, setting up law decrees, right? Setting up honorific inscriptions, that sort of thing. So that's the kind of mass communication that I'm talking about, those types of inscriptions. Really does go back into antiquity. If we think far back in antiquity, I should say, essentially once we have written communication, once the invention of writing exists, these type of public inscriptions exist. Right? Think about like the Code of Hammurabi, one of the most famous texts from antiquity, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. Right? We have inscriptions from there all the way through ancient Greece into ancient Rome. So those types of inscriptions are what I think of as mass communication. Other things that I also consider that are inscriptions are things like graffiti, which is a big thing that I work on. If we think of setting up a kind of formal inscription, let's say somewhere like the Roman Forum, right, and they set up like a big public inscription celebrating a certain emperor or something like that, that operates functionally the same way as a person who's writing an inscription, maybe a prayer to a god even, which is something I work on, right, in a corridor in Pompeii. It's an act of communication that intentionally is outward facing, right, and is intention to invoke engagement with the reader in some form, right? So I include that as a kind of form of mass communication. Now, going back to oral communication, one of the things that I also work on, and I'm writing a book on this right now, is what the Romans called and what I call acclamation. It has a little bit of a misleading term in the modern world because we tend to think of that as a kind of positive thing, right? A film is acclaimed. And it actually comes from the Roman term, and it actually is ad clama, which means to make a noise, like clamor, in the direction of somebody. Little Latin lesson, the ad is the preposition for the direction toward. But really what we're talking about is collective vocalization, right? This is acclamation. And this is one of the things, as I mentioned, I'm working pretty intensely on right now. And this is the kind of thing that, again, we actually encounter much more frequently than we probably think. It's just we don't rely on it as fundamentally as the Romans would have. And the two places that we, I think, kind of are most used to encountering it is actually the same place the Romans are. Again, it just doesn't serve the same kind of height of function, which is at political rallies and sporting events, right? So think about like political chants, when the whole group together is chanting these same words, right? That's acclamation. At sporting events, same thing, right? And often in both those instances, they're rhythmic, they're formulaic, right? So it's easy to catch on. That same thing. And for the Romans, there is no difference between the sporting events and what you say there and political rallies and what you say there. It's the same place, right? The sporting events are political spaces as much as they are spaces for entertainment. So those are the two kind of things that I specifically focus in on, these kind of inscriptions, including graffiti, and things like acclamation, these collective vocalizations.
So the things that we really have to understand is the centrality of an oral culture and oral transmission in this ancient times, this kind of intermediary literacy where people look at perhaps writings or slogans and they recognize what those writings or slogans are about, and this kind of culture of acclamation where people are chanting. And you would say there's like a direct parallel to what we have today, or what we have in the modern era, where, for example, when newspapers first became popular in the United States, most people couldn't read, but they would be read out by someone literate to a broader audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually the way you said it, I think encapsulates really well the point about the culture, right? There's something so fundamental about this kind of oral culture that is a little bit difficult for us to get our heads around living now. As you say, even 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, they wouldn't even have been quite as far removed because literacy was not at the rates that it is now. But it's just, orality was so central. This was the main way of communicating for the vast majority of people. So it is really a kind of paradigm shift when we think about the move away from an intentionally oral culture to a primarily literate culture.
Dr. Brinkman, you mentioned political spaces. So what was the relationship between these mass communications, quote unquote, and politics in ancient Rome?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because let's think about, so Rome's a great instance of this because Rome it's a republic, right? So it ostensibly has the democratic element of voting, which means that to win over the audience is really important, and to gauge the audience and how they react by something like acclamation is really important. So that really became the gauge for in ancient Rome is this kind of acclamation and oratory, right? So because of the nature of literacy, the Romans still are famous for things like rhetoric, right? And oratory and that sort of thing, right? Famously, they wrote handbooks and things like that. And Cicero writes a book about this, even that we have, or a notice of it, and about even the way that you stand, right? It's about what you're saying, but it's so performative, and they recognize how performative it is, and not just in terms of the language that they're conveying, but the entire body. Right, there's actually kind of a little morbid anecdote about this, which is when Cicero, right, the most famous orator in antiquity, and one of the people from ancient Rome about whom we know the most information, he wrote a series of speeches against Mark Antony, which were very negative. When Mark Antony came to power, he had Cicero murdered, and famously had not only, this might be apocryphal, but had not only his head chopped off and placed on the rostrum, which is the place where the orator speaks, but also his hands as well, because of the kind of performative notion, even of how you hold your hands when you're watching the orator. All of that stuff is very precise.
So you've given an example of, the importance of this, especially in the Republican era of Rome, because, of course, there is democracy, not what we would think of as democracy today, but there is some kind of popular politics. Can you talk a little bit about how this mass communications facilitated, perhaps, the transformation of Rome from a republic to an empire?
Yeah, and so this is one of the things that I argue sort of in my larger work, is that it was really central to it. The thing about crowds is that they're really difficult to control. And so in the late Republic, you started to have these figures like Sulla or Pompey or Julius Caesar, right? Probably most well known, who figured this out. And they started to realize that as they started to want more and more types of powers that were beyond what was constitutionally allowed, they realized that the way to do this is just forget voting. We're just going to go directly to the crowd, right? If we can win over the crowd, it doesn't matter what happens in the quote-unquote ballot box. And so as we see the breakdown of institutions like the voting comitia and things like that in the late Republic, and we see the rise of eventually Caesar as dictator, all of that is very much related. That comes down to the fact of how are we going to redefine our power, right? We're just going to go straight to the people. It's the most kind of populist type of idea in a certain way. And it's actually more populist than the voting, because even though citizens were allowed to vote, most people were not citizens. And even those were highly manipulated. And so it's actually more democratic in a certain way of going directly to the crowd, but it also allowed them to suggest, hey, grant me this new title that doesn't exist. Or Cicero, again, going back to him, he actually says, I was made consul, which is basically the highest position in the Republic, because the people made the acclamation for me. He says that outright, which is crazy if you think about it. It's just, he's like, he was technically still voted, but he doesn't say that. He says what matters was when the people gave me the title, not when it was officially voted on. And so this breakdown of institutions, one of the ways that they legitimized it was by saying, look, all the people agree with me, right? As long as we can get these mass amounts of people to all collectively chant, you are consul, you are consul, you are consul, right? That's more powerful and overwhelming than what happens in the ballot box, in a way. So those are very much related about going directly to the people as a way of subverting traditional forms of Republican power.
I mean, that's really fascinating, because it has a almost modern ring to it when we see the rise of populists in the 19th century. Napoleon III comes to mind, where he's able to overthrow the French Republic by appealing directly to the people. And we look at a lot of populist movements around the world, in places like India, places like Turkey, where you have quote-unquote democratic institutions, but you also have this kind of acclamation style of politics where there's an appeal to a popular will, an almost intangible popular will, which is, to a certain degree, democratic in a sense, in that it circumnavigates what are seen as increasingly illegitimate institutions and creates a new font of legitimacy for a political leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the kind of move from what it means to be legitimized changed over time, right? Once the kind of traditional or formal forms of recognizing power are failing, this kind of populism becomes very common in those kinds of situations.
As Rome moved into the imperial period, in what ways were mass media and mass communications mobilized and applied?
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of recognizing of the power of it that happens in the collapse of the Republic, once we start to get the emperors, right, they just ran with it effectively. And this became the main way of gauging political power, really was through acclamation, right, recognizing if you were popular or not. The thing that's really interesting is Augustus, right? So he's the first Roman emperor. And something that he actually does is he's actually very cautious about what he does with acclamation, right? He's famously makes himself very public. This is another big shift, right? The Roman emperor, the quote unquote good emperors, are the ones who go to the theater, who go to the Colosseum and make themselves known, not just to show that you're a kind of man of the people, but specifically so that the crowd could, which they did, do things like petition you, all by way of acclamation. But Augustus is really interesting because he realizes the power of it. And there's an anecdote where a group of people come and they want to acclaim him, right, with the power of dictator, which is exactly what got Julius Caesar, his adopted father, killed. And he's like, no, don't give this to me, right? Don't give this to me. So he's very aware of both the positives and the negatives. When we move later into imperial history, the instance that I like to look at specifically is the second imperial dynasty with the Flavians. So there's this period in 69 CE that we call the Year of the Four Emperors. It's basically after Nero dies. He's named an enemy of the state and takes his own life. So between actually 68 and 70, but we call it the 1 year. There's four emperors, as the name implies, the Year of the Four Emperors. And the last Roman emperor, Vespasian, he absolutely understands the power of acclamation and the ways to manipulate it outside of the city of Rome. Tacitus famously says in the histories where he writes about this period that the secret of empire had been let out, that power could be made other places than in Rome. And what Vespasian does is really interesting because he's fighting in the east, right? This is the wars where he's fighting, basically putting down a revolt in Judea. And he first has his troops name him in Judea. Now, importantly, he doesn't do this in Rome. All of the previous three people who all died, basically within a matter of months, all of them made the mistake of going directly to Rome and appealing to the people there. He doesn't do that. So he first has his troops acclaim him in Judea, where he's fighting, putting down the revolt. And then he does something really curious. He goes to Alexandria, probably the second largest city after Rome in the empire. And it's there that it's the people of Alexandria in the hippodrome, right, the horse racing track. It's there that the people recognize him as emperor. So it's actually the Alexandrians. And the language that they use, they acclaim him as the son of the god Ammon, as probably a follower of Serapis. These are all very Egyptian titles. And very intentional. We actually have a papyrus that records this. This is why we know that some of this that happens. So he realizes not only the power of acclamation, and that's their defining moment of that entire dynasty, is acclamation, but it's not from the people of Rome. Right, it's from the people that some of them would have been Romans, technically, in the city of Alexandria, and that's part of the Roman Empire. But he doesn't go back to Rome to do this. And so the point being, one of the things you start to see until we get eventually further down into the empire is the emperors really understand the power of acclamation. It becomes very apparent. In fact, by the time we get to Constantine, there's an official law that's passed that any acclamations that occur in any Roman cities have to be written down and sent to Rome because they want to know what's going on in the cities. And that for them is the best gauge than anything, right? So there's official law, right? That we're talking about the 4th century, but it becomes officially the policy that acclamation is essentially a function of the government at that point. So that's the kind of long overview of the Romans sort of figuring out the power of this particular type of behavior.
It seems to indicate then that the position of emperor in the Roman Empire was quite different from traditional notions of kingship, perhaps, in that, especially when we think of kingship in the, from the medieval period where the authority comes down from God. You have the divine right of kings, you have absolute monarchies, but the title emperor has different connotations to it.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting that you say that because we can actually see in the evolution, if we look at something even like acclamation, we can see in the evolution moving from exactly what you were saying of this position of the Roman emperor to what we would absolutely identify as a medieval king, especially in the Byzantine context, where actually acclamations get completely formalized. And this is the coronation, right? And acclamation still is a part of coronation in modern ceremonies, and it becomes just completely part of that. But it's the regularizing of it and the overt performative element of it that we might think of as like kind of coronation as being the element of it. And then, of course, because of that, you can control, quote unquote, where it's coming from. So as you say, like it's coming from God. Like the people are agreeing to this is like it's not coming from us, but they're still agreeing that we're not the ones doing it, right? But we're agreeing to allow you to have this power that's been bestowed upon you by some higher power. And because of the regularization of it, it's much easier to actually kind of formalize and make it, no, you have to say it this way as we want you to say it to get the point across. So absolutely, as you're saying, but we can see that evolution with the Roman emperor over time.
So there's a kind of shift away from the populist notion of an emperor towards a more monarchical notion of an emperor.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that people have written a lot about in late antiquity, especially in the East, that the emperor becomes more and more of a figurehead, further and further away from the people, right? The good emperors used to go out. Hadrian, right, famously used to go out and go to the baths and stuff, right? Very protected, but it's all performative, but to show again that that he's accessible. Over time, as we get to late antiquity, this is what changes, and that the emperor, or eventually right, kings in the medieval context, become further away from the people, and a lot of that is done by ceremony, right? So exactly that sort of thing that we can see happening.
What lessons do you think we can draw about popular politics from the Roman experience?
I think one thing is trying to maintain your individual voice. If we're talking about acclamation, one of the things that happens is you get caught up in the crowd. Social psychologists talk about this as like emotional energy, and you kind of go along with it. And we can see that very much in that kind of experience, but we can see the same thing online, right? You get caught up in the kind of crowd and lose your identity, which in let's say in the USA, in a kind of democracy, is really dangerous because it makes you kind of lose sight of what the democratic ideals that you think should be instilled. Those might be undermined by that sort of thing. So that's certainly one element of it, I think. And then just kind of the willingness to engage in things that we see in things like graffiti for the other kind of context for that sort of thing. The kind of openness of that is definitely something that we see, and how open you want to be with that, because the Romans were very open about it, and not being too regulatory in terms of that kind of speech, I would say as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brinkman. That's all we have time for this month. But if you would like to hear more of our conversation on popular politics, acclamation, the Roman Empire, please tune into our podcast version, which we have Talking History Extra, where we will continue this conversation. It's available at ksmu.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back. It's time for Talking History Extra, where we will be continuing our conversation with Dr. Bryan Brinkman about Rome and all things Roman. So, Dr. Brinkman, I want to begin by asking, what got you first interested in the Roman Empire, and specifically, what got you interested in this issue of graffiti, communications, acclamation?
Yeah, so for the first question, kind of the long view of it a little bit is that I was always kind of interested in pre-modern sort of stuff, and actually I was initially interested in medieval history, and then just kind of a series of circumstances. I ended up taking Latin because I was interested in medieval stuff, but they don't teach medieval Latin. You usually take classical Latin, combined with taking a course in Hellenistic history, where, if you know a little bit, this is the period after Alexander the Great, and it ends with the Romans. That kind of confluence of things, this is when I was an undergrad, right, got me interested in that sort of thing in general. The communication thing, and especially with something like graffiti, which I'm really interested in, is just, it gives us such a different insight into the world of these people than you would get reading the traditional texts. That sort of thing. And my students love it, right? It's such a great educational tool. So I think for that reason, because it just gives us a different view, I think it's actually really powerful in that way.
And, what kind of things do you find in the graffiti? How does the graffiti, obviously the medium is quite different from a written text. What kind of things are in that graffiti that are quite interesting? I'm assuming there's obscene things, that people are a lot more, let's say, crude in their communications, a lot more direct in certain ways than perhaps in a political treatise or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is kind of everything. Yeah, the kind of vulgar ones are kind of famous, right? That you get these kinds of things. But really, you get everything. The stuff that I'm actually really interested in and have worked on are the graffiti prayers, what I call prayers, and they're prayers, and most of them are to Venus because she's the goddess associated with the city of Pompeii, and they literally say like, "Dear Venus, I love this person. Please protect our love." And it's a prayer, and we don't have prayers of that. We know in theory they existed, but we don't have them because they're orally written. We have them in things like graffiti or very like performative kinds of things in text. So that's the kind of thing, those types of prayers that I'm really interested in. And then the kind of dialogic nature of it where, you have people writing about, one thing, and then a person will come along and write something else. And often they are very clever and funny and that sort of thing. And so that kind of communication, whether it's with another person scribbling or in the instance of they have to imagine that the god is in some way reading this, which is so fascinating to me, right? That there's some way present in the city. But just that kind of dialogue that you get in graffiti that it just doesn't exist elsewhere. That's the kind of stuff that I love.
So it's kind of like pre-modern Twitter.
Absolutely is, right? Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And not regulated.
Not regulated. So
no mods.
No mods. So people are, replying to certain pieces of graffiti positively, negatively. Of course, we still have graffiti today, but it doesn't serve, I would assume, exactly the same function. Although with things like, I guess, people declaring their love for each other, it's like, I don't know. Have you seen any love graffiti?
Yes, on Walnut Street. It's also still a popular way to project political sentiment. If you go to the large city, you'll often see lots of political graffiti. Yeah. Besides graffiti, what type of sources do you rely on as a Roman historian?
So basically, again, I break them down into two sorts, which are textual and material. And obviously the material stuff, anything you're working in the ancient world we have to rely on it more. I was going to say has more importance. That's not necessarily true, but we have to rely on it more. So, which can be everything, right? Whether it's buildings or little objects, anything in between, right? So the kind of material things. So it depends on what you're interested in. If you're looking at everyday life, I'm interested in the way that space is configured. So that gives us a big insight into the way they think about things. Like going back to thinking Pompeii, like we tend to think of public and private as these very different spheres. And if you look at the way that Pompeii is set up, and presumably it's a pretty average type of city of that size, those don't exist in the same way. Like where your house ends and where the city street begins is much more porous than we would think of in those sorts of ways. So it depends on what kind of questions you're asking. We look at material. And then for text, right, we have these, we do have histories, right? I rely on Tacitus and Livy and Plutarch and all of these kind of traditional historians who are writing about this period. But I tend to more rely on what we usually call documentary evidence. So things like inscriptions or papyri. Papyri is another big thing that I work on. I've edited texts that are like just, it'll sound really boring and it probably on its own isn't that exciting, but it's like a land petition basically. But when you get a bunch of those, it starts to reveal a picture. So we have the kind of textual material, especially for me, the documentary type of stuff like that. And then the actual archaeological material, which depending on what you're looking for, you can find some way that it will fill in some sort of historical gap.
So Western interest in the Roman Empire goes back to, the very birth of history as a modern academic discipline. This may be a little bit of a broad question, but how has the study of the Roman Republic, Roman Empire, changed from those more traditional modes of looking at Roman history, which tended to rely on textual sources, to how a modern Roman historian would look at formulate their questions and how that shaped the field more generally?
Yeah, so I think the big thing about it is just how interdisciplinary it's become, which makes perfect sense because when you have a dearth of information in general, you want to grab it from everywhere that you can. And so we still have these lines, although even the last few decades, these are, dissolving, right? But we still have these lines of like, I'm an archaeologist, I'm a historian, I'm a classicist, meaning like I love Virgil or whatever, I love Homer, right? And those lines are all like dissolving a lot. So I think that's the big move, is that I'll look at Homer as a Roman historian in a way that like people wouldn't have, which you would think, how do you do that, right? But I would do that in a way, and from a kind of textual way that a traditional Roman historian wouldn't have 40, 50 years ago, and then also include this piece of archaeology over here. So it's really about bringing in all of these different elements together and becoming comfortable working with a lot of different types of information. That's really the big shift. And we kind of figured out, let's not be in our little pockets. Let's try to combine stuff as much together as we can.
So what would you say are the kind of popular misconceptions about Roman history that perhaps historians have kind of put in the past, but still exist in the broader public and the broader public's imagination about what the Roman Republic and Roman Empire were like?
What I would say, and I don't think it's necessarily a misconception, but maybe a kind of misguided focus, which is that I think when people still think of Rome, especially the Roman Empire, there's such an emphasis on military history and that sort of, the Roman army and kind of the high political history is still the big emphasis that probably most people think of, like the Roman emperor or the Roman army and conquering and all of that sort of stuff. And yes, that's true. But the cultural questions, right, and the questions of social history, but especially the culture, for me, is so rich, right, and so wonderful. And the way that the Romans take all of these different elements and make something new of it. The other thing that's related to that is what we mean by Roman. So when I think of Roman, I probably am not thinking of the same thing that the average person is, right? When I'm thinking of Roman, especially like Roman history in a broad sense, I'm including people who live in small places in Western Asia that are in theory, part of the Roman Empire, and they're influenced by Roman culture. They might not even know that much about anything that's going on, and they might not consider themselves Romans. And technically, I guess they're not if you look at it from political terms. But to me, when I'm thinking of what is a Roman, that person absolutely could fit into what I mean as a Roman. So I'm not just talking about the senators who are, wearing their togas in Rome. I'm thinking about this broad cultural overview, and that's what I love about Rome and history, is that all of these different interactions together, right? And what really means to be Roman is such an open question. And if you want it to mean, if you want to look at it from a particular perspective, you can justify saying, no, this is Roman, even though they might not have thought of it as Roman. Like, I think I'm treating this under the guise of Roman because Rome is such a huge entity. And so, culture moves below the surface that people don't understand. So they might not recognize themselves as Roman, but some of the things they do in their daily lives absolutely came from like the consequence of the Roman Empire being this kind of mixed together. So even what I think of as a Roman is probably a little bit different than what a lot of people think of when they think of a Roman.
And, some of the wealthiest and most economically advanced parts of the Roman Empire are in places like the Southern Balkans, Western Asia, Egypt. And these are places where the Greek language is predominant, even with the Roman conquest?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
And so, and then when we go on to sort of later historical eras, it is the Greek wing of the Roman polity that takes up the title of Romans. In modern Turkish, for example, the word for a Greek is Rum, Roman. And ironically, in modern Kurdish, or in sort of older Kurdish, the word for a Turk from Istanbul was a black Roman, as opposed to a white Roman. So the vocabulary of Rome still exists. The whole European portion of the Ottoman Empire was called Rumili, which is Roman. So this Roman political tradition was internalized by not just the speakers of Latin or the Romance languages, but also in the Greek portions of the Roman Empire, where they took on that identity, and in fact it became the center with the move to Byzantium as the capital.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are scholars that would honestly tell you the Roman Empire ended in the 15th century, basically when the fall of Byzantium, right? Or the fall of Constantinople. But also kind of related to that, one of the other ways I sort of conceive of Rome a little bit differently is, and one of the misconceptions perhaps is the idea of like the fall of Rome, right? It's probably like one of the most famous topics you would think Rome fell. It didn't. It evolved, right? Institutions fell and they changed, but it's much. I'm not a biologist, but it's probably better to think of like the extinction of the dinosaurs. Well, kind of, but not really. It's more that they changed into these other elements, or at least parts of them changed into these other elements. So there isn't like a date of when Rome fell. It just changed into these other things. And as you're saying, you can absolutely still see it so ingrained within everything you were saying in institutions like Turkey. I mean, the Catholic Church is basically an institution of that we can trace directly back to the powers of Rome and the Roman emperor, right? So they still exist in these ways that it's just changed, right? So I kind of hate the question because it always comes up with like, when and why did Rome fall? And I'm like, well, one, the better question is, why did it last so long, if we even want to put it that way? And then the other point is, it didn't really, what does it mean to fall? Like, what does that mean, right?
I mean, I think that's an important point. Even with the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, Mehmet the Conqueror took the title of Kayseri Rum, which is the Roman Emperor. The Russians as well proclaimed themselves to be the inheritors of Rome. So you could make the argument the Roman Empire lasted up till 1917 and the overthrow of the Tsar.
People have made that argument as well. The term Kaiser is actually more how the Romans would pronounce the term Caesar. That's not how you pronounce it in classical Latin. It's pronounced Kaiser. And so Kaiser is actually a remnant of the actual way that the Romans would have pronounced the name.
Yeah, and we see this in names. I mean, it's really fascinating thinking about the Roman Empire because, there's a Roman villa close to my hometown in Britain, and you can find a very similar architectural style existing in, let's say, modern-day Syria. This is a huge cultural entity, and even if the political form of the classical Roman Empire dissolved in the West, it wasn't this dramatic fall where the Huns turn up and destroy everything.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a lot more complicated dynamic, and Rome still lives with us today. A lot of our political vocabulary is still derived from the Roman Empire. The founders of the American Republic, when they drew on, what were they drawing on to develop their republican tradition? It was
Rome.
It was Rome. These were people deeply steeped in Roman history who, you could even call them Rome lappers to a certain extent.
Really, yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, it had that kind of significance for sure. That the way that they thought about the kind of institutions and law, international law, the basis of it is Roman law. Most law, if you study it in Europe, is Roman law, right? Our tradition is the Anglo-Saxon law more, but most of the world, it's rooted in the principles of Roman law directly. So even that's another remnant that's absolutely fundamental, right? I mean, it changes people's lives, and that's a remnant of Roman institutions.
And of course, linguistically, significant portions of Europe and the Americas speak Romance languages, which are directly descended from Latin, different forms of vernacular Latin. And that's in Western Europe as well as Eastern Europe. People always forget the Romanians, another remnant of the Romans.
Yeah, absolutely. And that language is actually probably maybe the closest in terms of the way that the language actually functions. But yeah, I mean, the Romance languages are Romance because they're related to Rome. That's where it comes from.
So as a kind of final question that we always ask everybody on the show, it's if people are interested in learning more about Rome, do you have some book recommendations that you could give us and suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one that I would recommend that kind of comes to mind for a general overview, if you're interested in Roman history, is a wonderful book by the scholar Mary Beard, not the scholar of the U.S. history, but she's the modern scholar teaching in Cambridge, Mary Beard. And she has a recent book called SPQR, which is Senatus Populusque Romanus, which is which means Senate and Roman people, which is the way that the Romans defined the state officially in the Republic. This is what it meant, SPQR. But it's a wonderful overview, and it's meant for a general public. And she's one of the best. Not only is she wonderful scholar, so she really knows what she's talking about. She's one of the best communicators of antiquity, especially of I think, any person that I've read in a very long time. And anything from Mary Beard. She has a great book called The Fires of Vesuvius about Pompeii. She has a book on the Roman Triumph. So I'd recommend SPQR. If you're more interested in kind of social history, there's a book by Robert Knapp called Invisible Romans. And it's much more the social history looking from the bottom up. Also very accessible. And then not a modern text, but read Livy. read not all of it. Would not recommend that. It's very long. Even the parts that survive, which is not most of it. But the first 5 books of Livy. Because this is the Romans this is their origins. This is, if you want to understand what the Romans think of themselves, read the first 5 books of Livy, because this is them telling their own proto-history. It's so meaningful, and this is what I teach it in, it's myth, legend, I teach it in my myth course, but absolutely read Livy, and read Suetonius, which is the Lives of the Caesars, right? Or I, Claudius, which is basically just takes Suetonius and then kind of updates the language a little bit, but that's what that is. So a couple of ancient texts and a couple of modern texts, I think that anybody interested in this stuff will really enjoy.
As a kind of follow-up, is there, since Rome has held this position in the popular consciousness for so long, is there any like popular culture that you would suggest as being a good representation of actual Roman life?
Yeah. Actually, the HBO series Rome, especially the first season, is quite good. The people, actually, Mary Beard was one of the consultants that worked on that. So for the kind of like stuff about everyday life that it shows is really good. It's really good. And the political history is just, it's as good as it's going to be for a kind of show like that. So I would definitely recommend that. I like Gladiator. It's okay. Not my personal favorite, but certainly it fits within that genre. And then there's actually Spartacus, right, which is a really important film, which is based in a real events, right? But it really is good at showing the way that that Americans think of themselves as the new Romans, and not necessarily in a positive way. If you've seen that film, right, I won't spoil it, but you've probably all heard that I am Spartacus, right? So I'd recommend the film Spartacus for sure, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brinkman, and thank you, listener. You can check us out again next month on the first Thursday at 12:06 here on KSMU, and you can find us always wherever you find your podcasts.
Talking History is a collaboration between KSMU and the Missouri State Department of History. Thanks for listening.